Dear guests, students, colleagues, friends, welcome to the 2026 Schuman Lecture. And of course, it's a pleasure to welcome you here in Maastricht. And I guess most of you maybe live in the city right now, so you have the whole feeling of what that means. Because I would say Maastricht is a city where European history is not only remembered, but it continues to shape our daily lives. A city shaped by the borders, by the Belgium and the German border, where we work on both sides, where we meet friends, where we go and get our gasoline, where we do our shopping on both sides, and where students go to both sides, Belgium and Germany. And as our late colleague, Mathieu Segers, often emphasized, Maastricht is not simply a symbol of Europe, but a place where Europe takes concrete political form. That insight carries a responsibility, not only to remember Europe's past, but to engage with its present and its future. And so each year around Europe Day on May 9th, we take a moment to reflect on the ideas that inspired the European project. Robert Schuman reminded us that Europe needs a soul, an ideal, and a political will to serve it. And his lasting contribution was to show that Europe could be built step by connecting former adversaries, enemies, so closely that conflict would become unthinkable. And if you let these words resonate today, they raise a question at the same time. It feels increasingly urgent at a moment where Europe is tested by geopolitical tensions, by internal differences, and by the challenge of maintaining a shared sense of direction. What is the ideal today? And how do we give that ideal a meaning? And we meet here in the city of Maastricht, where the treaty was signed, a treaty that reshaped our continent. And it reminds us that Europe is not an abstract idea, but the result of political choices, of negotiation, and of the willingness to find common ground. And in his work, Mathieu Segers showed that European integration has often moved forward in times of uncertainty. Not despite crises, but through it. Moments of disruption have often also created conditions for change and renewal. And the question today, however, is whether our political systems are still capable of translating such moments into a sense of direction for the future. And that's why it's really great that this evening we have the honor to welcome Professor Jonathan White, Professor of Politics at the London School of Economics. If we understand it, his work addresses exactly this question that is central to democratic life today. Are our political systems still capable of offering direction? Or have they become mainly focused on managing the present? And exactly, we're having the same discussion in our city today. We had elections not so long ago. So even today we had this discussion, are we looking at the long term? Do we dare dream about the future? How will Maastricht develop as a city? Or are we focused on all the dilemmas that we have today? In any case, in Jonathan White's book, The Long Run, you reflect on how our understanding of the future has changed and what that means for democracy. He shows that democracy depends not only on institutions, but also on the belief that the future remains open and it can be shaped together. That powerful insight is both demanding and powerful by itself. And it invites us not only to imagine the future, but also to recognize that different visions of that future will exist, and that choices will have to be made. And this is not a question for political leaders, but for all of us. And so, dear audience, if Maastricht is to remain a truly European city, it must be more than a place of memory. It must also be a place where Europe is discussed, questioned, and shaped in education, in public life, and in dialogue across borders. And this makes it a perfect setting for tonight's lecture, not only to reflect, but to engage. I hope this evening encourages all of us to reflect on the role we play in shaping Europe's future and on the responsibility that comes with it. And it's my honor to give the floor to our speaker for the 2026 Schuman Lecture. Please give a warm hand to Professor Jonathan White.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for coming to join us for this this talk about the politics of the future. Democratizing the future in today's Europe is the title that I have chosen for it. And as you've just heard, some of the reflections that I will go into come out of a longer period of thinking about the future as a theme in politics and what is specific to today, the ways in which today's politics is in some ways perhaps marked by a very different set of outlooks on the future from in other periods past. And I guess with a particular interest in what you might call the uses and abuses of the future in politics, the ways in which questions to do with hopes, expectations, fears, anxiety, and so on are, of course, something which is a kind of elemental part of politics. Who gets to shape those things, I think, acquires quite a lot of power in the process. This is the theme of the book, which is over there, and it's the theme that I want to draw out further this evening in my talk. And I thought one way to set things up would be around two little quotations, which I guess encapsulate some of the themes that I'm interested in, and perhaps also in their contrasts give a little flavor of the argument that I want to make. The first quotation is in some ways redolent of a very different era, seems in some ways quite foreign to the way that so many politicians and perhaps we as individuals think about time, about the future in the present, and is, if you like, a kind of reminder of how perhaps from the beginning of modern politics, if we can speak crudely from, let's say, the 18th century, from that period where in so many European countries you see a movement from monarchy to something that at least claims to embody democracy, that as you see that shift in political institutions, in the structure of politics, that alongside this goes a kind of temporal shift. These are arguments that have been made by historians frequently in recent decades, Reinhard Koselleck perhaps being the most notable. And so there's a good argument that can be said that modern politics has very often taken its cue from ideas of the future, and that the great ideological clashes of the 19th century, the 20th century, were in some ways all about clashes over the future and who gets to shape the future, what the future brings, what can be expected of it. And so the first quotation here is Karl Kautsky, of course, theorist associated with the German Social Democrats, giving us in this text called The Commonwealth of the Future, which is very much his most kind of future-oriented piece of work, I guess a little flavor of how, for many socialists of the late 19th and into the 20th century, the future was at the very center of their politics. Of course, it was consciously a politics of progress, and progress understood partly as a kind of historical achievement, partly as a trajectory to be continued into the future. And of course, for Kautsky, as you see in this quotation that I'll read out now, the sense that perhaps socialism, more than other ideologies, embodied that commitment to thinking about the future. This was almost its unique calling card. As he put it in this reflection of 1892, all other political parties live only in the present, from hand to mouth. The Socialist Party is the only one which has a definite aim in the future, the only one whose present policy is dictated by a general, consistent purpose. So there, I think a statement which bears witness, as I say, to what for, in particular, socialism was a very central theme of its politics. But of course, as political scientists have been saying repeatedly over subsequent analyses, the socialists pied a model that would be emulated by other parties. In other words, this is not just a story of the significance of an orientation to the future in one left-wing strand of politics. Some of you will be familiar with the political scientist Duverger and the idea of contagion from the left, that model of politics pioneered by socialism in the 19th century, and this is partly a story of organization, the mass party, but I think it's also a wider story exactly about temporal orientations and this model of thinking about the present partly in the light of an anticipated future. This is something which other types of politics, anything but socialist, whether it's Christian Democrats, whether it's liberals, would, I think, also start to see as increasingly important, particularly as politics becomes mass politics, and you need some type of vision, let's say, to spark people's interest, to give people motivation to involve themselves in politics. One reason I put down this quotation was simply to sort of to say who speaks like this in politics today. Of course, at some level, this seems very, very remote in time, this central emphasis on the future as a lodestar, as a point of orientation. And as I will go into in a bit more depth in just a moment, it's often said by contemporary social scientists that we live rather in an age of presentism, an age in which the future has somehow been lost. That's something that I want to go to in just a moment, but perhaps is anticipated by a quotation that in its stark form orients the whole of socialist politics to the future and perhaps jolts us insofar as even those that claim the lineage of socialism today often don't cast themselves in these terms. The other quotation I put down, and I put down two because I guess I'm thinking of my lecture as something of a kind of, it's inhabiting the place of tension between these two quotations, and perhaps it's interested also in a shift from the one to the other. The second quotation is this: there's always problems in life. There's this problem, solve that problem, but there need to be things that inspire you. There need to be things that make you glad to wake up in the morning and say, I'm looking forward to the future. Of course, Elon Musk speaking at Trump's inauguration, these were pretty heady times for Elon Musk himself, perhaps at an individual level, had every reason to be excited about the future. And it's striking in what's a fairly short intervention. This term keeps coming up over and over again about excitement for the future. We're going to make the future good, the need to assure the future of civilization, this kind of grand rhetoric, and so on. This is a pronounced theme in the short intervention that Elon Musk makes at the moment of Trump's inauguration. And again, I had some kind of some thoughts on my mind as I decided to engage with this quotation. One, simply picking up on the previous one, who talks in politics like this idea of excitement for the future, of the need to precisely use the future as a sort of motivation to get people interested in politics, interested in public affairs. In some ways, again, it's kind of, sometimes when I present this quotation, I reveal that it's Elon Musk, and it's not easy to guess that it's Elon Musk, but perhaps it's fairly easy to guess that it's not a contemporary politician, because, again, do contemporary politicians talk in quite this fashion? But I think the other reason to engage with this quotation is because it foreshadows something that I want to come back to in a bit more depth later on, which is what you might say the enthusiasm for future-oriented thinking in Silicon Valley. In other words, there is, I think, a story of contrast to be told here between the politics of the future as it is expressed in political parties, political leaders, and the politics of the future as it is expressed in places that we might not normally expect to find it. But as I will want to argue in due course, contra many of the widely diffused suspicions that we live in a presentist age, that no one is particularly engaged in the future, I think, on the contrary, in pockets of power and wealth such as Silicon Valley, there is a great interest in the future and a great interest to use and to shape expectations of the future as a kind of political resource, as something that can cultivate power, that can cultivate certain interests associated with the corporations of Silicon Valley. And so you have, I think, what is one of my larger themes, I guess, is that the politics of the future is something very consequential. Who gets to shape these things matters, and that we can tell a sort of story whereby politicians have often vacated this territory of contesting visions of the future in politics, often focusing on much more tangible, immediate, short-term goals, and as they do so, they precisely create a space that can be occupied by other types of corporate actors, especially who can exactly use this to their own benefit. So those are the themes that I want to get to as we go along, and of course one reason I want to make those points is to arrive at this sort of problem, I guess, which is that the cultivation of ideas of the future today, I think, is often in the hands of those who are very hard to exert democratic control over. At least the Kautskys of this world, whether or not you are yourself a socialist, at least there was some type of relationship there to political institutions, to electoral channels, to ways in which these ideas of the future could be contested. And of course, that is perhaps precisely what is in question as the capacity to shape expectations of the future moves from the political realm of representative politics into the realm of corporate power. And so at the end, I'll come back to some themes to do with democratizing the future. Okay, so that's roughly the shape of it. The first section that I wanted to go into a bit more depth with is exactly on this theme of in what ways, if at all, do we live in societies marked by a sort of indifference to the future. I think in some ways this is kind of part of our common sense. It obviously inspires a lot of concerns, whether it's to do with climate change, whether it's to do with technological change, that a certain unawareness of where we might be going, or an incuriousness about where we might be going, might be something that is very deleterious to the public interest in whatever particular society you have in mind. So that there is a sort of a possible problem to do with the future, that the future might be in crisis, I think is something that has a certain type of everyday plausibility to it. And as I said before, it's an argument that you sometimes find rendered as a diagnosis of especially representative democracy. I put down Jan Zielonka here, someone who, as well as writing about this theme, of course, has also written about matters to do with the European Union and European integration. So a figure that has more than one point of crossover with our conversation today. And in a book just shortly before the book that I wrote myself, Jan exactly makes this case for, I guess, a kind of a loss of the future as the horizon of contemporary politics. Channeling, I guess, long-term suspicions that democracy tends towards a certain presentism, that democracy, with its structures of electoral cycles, with the incentivization that it gives to politicians to think about what they can achieve between now and the next election, that it structurally tends towards a certain type of short-termism. That people like Karl Kautsky are somehow cut down to size through the logic of institutional inertia. Zielonka makes this type of argument about the structure of democracy more generally, and I think combines it, as many others have also done, with a certain cultural diagnosis to do with the crisis of themes of progress, of expectations of positive change, and so on, to arrive at a characterization of contemporary politics as marked by a certain type of whether it's presentism or short-termism or something that occupies the space between the two, if we think of short-termism as something within the electoral cycle, that this is simply how contemporary politics has come to look. I find this quite a compelling thesis, and in some ways it's something that I'm drawn to, and indeed enmeshed to some degree in the argument I'm making. At the same time, I think it would be somewhat misleading to think of contemporary societies as somehow systematically indifferent to the future, and perhaps especially politicians, our representatives, that one might say this of electoral politics, I think is also perhaps somewhat misleading, or at least it only gets half the truth. I was struck, it's now I think about a year and a half ago, maybe more like 2 years ago, in Italy. Maybe some of you have followed this political, I guess, controversy around an exhibition in Rome exactly on the theme of futurism as an aesthetic movement of 100 years ago. People like Marinetti, Balla, and so on. And it was an exhibition which I think attracted a lot of political interest from the incoming Meloni government in Italy. There were accusations that this government interfered in the curation of the exhibition before it was opened, and ultimately that it was a kind of interference that worked to maybe sanitize a movement that, of course, had quite close connections with Mussolini's Italy, but more than that, simply to kind of reclaim it as a positive aspect of Italian culture in the present. There's a New York Times piece about this, which goes into some depth on the kind of the nitty-gritty of who resigns from the exhibition and so on, at what point and with what type of motivation. If you're interested in the case, then by all means follow it up. But I guess the larger theme that one might extract from it is simply that if a government wants to intervene in kind of sort of cultural politics of exhibitions on ostensibly non-political themes, futurism, of course, was in the first instance an aesthetic movement with politics attached to it. To the extent that a government sees this as important, as a kind of meta-politics, you might say, that these kind of cultural questions are politically significant, then I guess that betrays a certain interest in themes of the future, themes of the aesthetics of technological change. This is an exhibition that was also about the technological innovations of 100 years ago, seaplanes and so on, kind of the and futurism itself, of course, was highly interested in technological change. Here you had an exhibition that clearly was felt to be of political importance to a government of the right and wanted to have some type of control about how people are thinking about a movement that was all about the future in its time. But of course, it would be quite a step from this to say that this is a politics of the future. In some sense, it's a kind of nostalgia for futurism, a nostalgia for lost futures in Sri Lanka's terms. And I think maybe this is what you often get in a variety of different countries on the contemporary right, is a kind of incipient interest in recapturing certain themes of future orientation, an interest perhaps in disruption, to take a term that often is used on the right, particularly in Trumpian politics, an interest in coming threats. Think of how in the US it's all about civil war, the coming breakdown, social breakdown, the prospect of something bad around the corner. So I think on right-wing politics, insofar as we can cluster these internationally, and I think we can, there is often a kind of interest both in futurism's past and how they might be of enduring relevance and how they might speak to contemporary themes of technological change, progress, and so on, but also a kind of a politics of anxiety, of shaping popular interests in what might lie around the corner, in doing so in a way that can speak to far-right concerns. So, is that a lost future? Possibly not. I would say that there is an enduring significance and interest in the world to come and imaginations of the world to come, even in political traditions that we often might think of as backward-looking, as nostalgic, or as oriented to a project of restoration of something that once was. I think, to take a quite different political strand on the centre-left, again, you might say the standard story tells us that centre-left parties, I come from Britain, think of the British Labour Party under Starmer, is somehow indifferent to the future, presentist, or lost in emergency management, lost in firefighting, always responding to events as they arise. And again, I think one level that would seem to be a bit odd. Don't we live in times where such governments set up horizon scanning institutions, set targets for growth, set decarbonisation goals, are very heavily oriented into a certain type of orientation to things that may come in the future, targets to achieve, threats to manage. So again, I think one might say it's not that the future is absent in centre-left politics any more than it's absent in the politics of the right. But maybe what is more specifically absent, and which is, I guess, a million miles from the Kautsky quotation that I began with, is a type of orientation to the future which is about a kind of programmatic vision of how things could be. In other words, not specific targets, specific threats, particular concerns, but something that wraps them into a wider program. And of course, that couples that with a sense of the capacity to control the future not as something that's simply coming towards you, that maybe you try to dodge, or you manage, that's a problem like a train coming towards you, but rather something that you might try to control, that you might try to direct in some kind of trajectory that is responsive to your preferences, values, a normative agenda of some kind. And I think it's this which I think one can more credibly say is precisely what is rather different about the politics of today from that high modern politics of mass political parties with ideologies, is exactly that type of more general transformative vision. And I'm citing here Adam Przeworski, who's made a remark much to this effect. Any transformative vision of a common future died in the early 1980s. Maybe that word common future is worth emphasis too. One of the themes of the book I wrote is exactly how the future can be thought of in many different ways. It can be thought of as a near future or a far future. One of those dichotomies is the future as something individual versus the future as something shared, something in common. And I think what Przeworski is bringing attention to here is also the way in which perhaps contemporary politics, insofar as it talks about the futures of people in society, it's often speaking to them as individuals, speaking to them as a kind of customers in a more neoliberal sense, but often with particular fragmentations of those visions rather than wider, more transformative visions, as Przeworski puts it, for society as a whole. Certainly, as I say, coming from Britain and from the current centre-left government, this, I think, describes rather well the nature of the politics that we see being pursued there. So, the lost future understood not as a type of indifference to the future, not as a kind of entirely backward-looking or presentist kind of politics, but a kind of politics that, insofar as it has anything to say about the future, often fragments it into very specific, concrete concerns and treats those somehow as facts to be negotiated, to be managed, as opposed to something that can be transformed through politics itself. So I wanted to say a little bit more about what's at stake here. And this, again, is one of the themes I've been particularly interested in the last couple of years. When political philosophers talk about why the future matters, they often make an argument to do with perhaps what we owe to future generations, some notion of intergenerational justice, for example. That's one way of thinking about why you might want to have the future present in our politics, because if it's absent, you might say we neglect those that we should be thinking about, whether it's the young, the unborn, those who are somehow deserving of our attention because our choices have implications for the lives that they will live. That's not the way that I want to approach this problem. I don't want to argue against that. I think it's a perfectly valid way of thinking about the future. In politics, it comes with complications, and these have been well discussed by philosophers about how one can think about the interests and values of future generations, what it means to owe things to people that do not yet exist. That's a whole set of concerns which I don't want to enter into, but are productively discussed by a lot of contemporary philosophy. For me, what's at stake is at least as much about what happens in the moving present when a certain way of thinking about the future is lost. And that's not because it's not exclusively about how we might do damage to future generations, but even if we don't do damage to future generations, or maybe if we can't confidently talk about what it is to do good or bad to those to come, nonetheless, even within the moving present, something would be lost if we were to somehow, in Jelonka's terms, be experiencing a sort of loss of the future. And I put 3 headings down to try and capture this thought. As I say, in a moment I want to go on to where the future is alive and well in this kind of visionary fashion in Silicon Valley, but first I want to continue this thought about why the politics of the future, why its place in democracy might somehow be important. And these are all themes that I think should be intuitive, but maybe don't get spelt out all that often. The first one is to do with critical perspective on the present. I mentioned a moment ago that many historians would like to say that the future becomes a theme in politics in the 18th century. Clearly, there's plenty of debate around that. But I guess the underlying thought would be that the future's got a history as a concept, that maybe not all societies across time have had something to name with that concept, that it becomes a theme, particularly when change happens. Because when the world is changing, you have a reason to name a future that may be different from the present. That's when it becomes a necessary concept. If tomorrow looks like today and looks like yesterday, maybe certain categories of this kind are less useful. And as the future becomes a theme in the 18th century, I think one of the opportunities that people are quick to make use of is this way of thinking about the present from the perspective of the future. Utopian literature is something that I've had some interest in this respect. When we think of utopian literature, of course, maybe some of us think about Thomas More and kind of a narrative of traveling to faraway lands to learn how people there do things very differently from how they do it in the here and now. And of course, what you see in the 18th century is what's sometimes called the temporalization of utopia, that the foreign land becomes the future. And so you start to get narratives of people who go to sleep for 700 years and wake up in the future and then report to the reader what is to be learnt from this glorious future. Louis-Sébastien Messier is someone I talk about in the book, who writes a book just before the French Revolution called The Year 2440. And it's basically about a Paris 700 years into the future, a Paris which is better illuminated, cleaner, less crime. It's a utopian account, of course, and as is often said with utopian accounts, somehow tracks the concerns of its time. But I think what's interesting about it, and of course utopian literature is only one example of this, you could say the same about party ideologies, party programs. You could say the same, I'm sure, about the Kautsky text that I began with, that this use of the future in politics as a way of thinking about the present with a certain type of critical distance. When people like Messier are writing about a Paris 700 years into the future, of course it is a way of expressing a certain type of critique of the Paris of the 1700s. And I think this is a very important role that the future has played, perhaps for 200 years, of course, modern politics after that period in the 1780s of people like Messier, creating this genre of reflection, which is as a way of thinking about how the present could be different. Because if you write a story about the future, of course, what you're saying is the present is unstable. The Thomas More story of traveling to the utopia on the other side of the world is a different type of account, because that doesn't really put in question the here and now. It tells you there's something else, maybe something to be learned from it, gives you a sort of a sense of contextual comparison, but it doesn't tell you that the place where you are now is in any sense sort of fragile. But of course, once you have a future-oriented utopia, when you are writing about Paris in the 1770s and you're envisaging Paris in the 2440s, you're saying that this Paris won't always be. It's an intervention that says change is going to happen. Maybe not in your lifetime, maybe not soon afterwards, but the world is contingent. It can be perhaps changed through intervention. And so I think this is one of the first points that I find interesting about the place of the future in politics, is as a way of putting the present not just in a kind of critical perspective, but one that incites a certain relationship to agency. The second point I put here under the theme of collective identity. Of course, anyone who studied nationalism will be fully aware of the ways in which the past can be put in the service of collective identity, a sense of common fate, treating the present as somehow the inheritance of a common past. But of course, this is also something that the future, I think, has often played a role of in politics as well. The idea of a common fate, the idea that a certain type of collectivity can be evoked through its relationship, through time, and through its projection into the future. And of course, isms like socialism, perhaps quintessentially, might be thought of as in exactly these terms, by evoking collective categories that move from the present into the future, whether it's the party, whether it's the union, whether it is the class, whether it's the ism itself. These are all ways in which a certain type of collectivity can be formed in politics. Of course, as you can see, I'm saying insofar as these things drop out, then of course maybe some of the resources for collectivities in politics suffer as well. So the future in that respect as a sort of a resource for thinking about the formation of a we in politics, of a collectivity. And of course in a way that is in some ways much more creative than the use of the past. You can always use the past, as I've said, but you're limited to some degree by the collectivities that have existed in the past. Locate yourself in the future and you open up new possibilities at the same time. That again, I think, whether it's through ideological traditions, through party manifestos I think have always been, perhaps at least into more recent decades, have always been that combination of a diagnosis of where you want to go, but also a kind of evocation of who is going to be the agent that takes you there. Manifestos, and I'm thinking mainly in politics, but I think the same applies to aesthetic manifestos as well, that they are this kind of double intervention on the one hand, evoking where you want to go, a bit like the first point, as a kind of critical perspective on the present, but also as a sort of way of cultivating a sense of the collective that is going there. And the third point that I wanted to make here on this theme of why the future matters in politics, why it has mattered in politics, would be to do with commitment in adversity. This concept of the transition trough is one that comes from left-wing politics, although I think its application is potentially wider than this. But the argument that's sometimes been made, and I'm thinking of people like Eric Olin Wright, who's made this argument, is that basically any type of effort to make the world better often makes things worse in the short term. Partly because people that don't want the world to change make it their business to try and disrupt things and to convince people that maybe they're better off abandoning their hopes of a better future. You can see that socialists coining these kind of concepts would have been interested in, well, what happens if a party takes power? If a left-wing party takes power, well, you might think, oh, life will get better for the people that party is meant to represent. It'll get better for the economic interests on whose behalf they stand. But of course, people like Wright coining this concept, they're saying no, because the first breakthrough of such a party is likely to incite a kind of backlash. It's likely to incite those that want to ensure that that success is transient. The general point here, and I think it applies when you think about climate change as well, would be that any type of effort to change politics, to change society for the better, often in the short term doesn't come with kind of happy music attached. It doesn't immediately seem to be doing what you want it to be doing. This point is often made, as I say, with climate change, that kind of transition technologies can often come with costs. They can often result in changes in lifestyles that may seem like they make people worse off, at least in the short term. And here again, I think the place of the future in politics has often been as a way of offering some kind of counterweight to that problem. If precisely you've got a problem of commitment, of perseverance in such contexts, it's often by invoking the further future that you can cope with the problems of the nearer future. You have a basis for some kind of resilience there. As I say, this is a strong theme, I think, on those kinds of politics most oriented to the problem of social transformation on the left, but I think they have some resonance in contemporary politics with concerns such as climate change. Any type of thing that forces a kind of change upon us, which may not always look like it is in the short term working or working in a desirable way. So all of this then to say that if there was any credence to this idea that contemporary politics somehow has lost a certain orientation to the future, maybe not an interest in the future, we still set targets, we still fear certain types of breakdown, social, environmental, and so on, but insofar as something more general has been lost, a more kind of positive, confident outlook on the capacity to shape the future collectively, then this, I think, comes with some kind of costs, because that type of orientation to the future, I think, has had, in these ways, and surely others as well, an important place in modern politics. I wanted to now pick up this thread about corporate futures. I've been talking about political futures. I've been talking about the party as, if you like, a future-oriented organization par excellence of modern politics. And for Kautsky, as we saw at the beginning, that's exactly what the Socialist Party was. It's that vehicle by which a certain orientation to the future is maintained in time. Well, here I wanted to talk, as I say, about a rather different type of entity, and with this link to Silicon Valley that I mentioned before. To help me make this link, I put down a quotation from a British Ghanaian author called Eshun. This is actually written, I think it's about 25 years ago. I think in some ways it's very apt to the things I want to talk about, which are more recent, but it's from a text in the early 2000s. And his basic point, which I think comes through in this quotation, is that the future matters not just for the kind of reasons I've been saying about it's a sort of resource for politics, for democracy, but he gives us another reason as well. It matters because if you don't take an interest in it, then someone else is going to take an interest. And someone else can shape expectations, hopes, fears in a way that may not be to your interests. As Eshun says, in the colonial era of the early to middle 20th century, avant-gardists from Walter Benjamin to Frantz Fanon revolted in the name of the future against a power structure that relied on control and representation of the historical archive. Today, the situation is reversed. The powerful employ futurists and draw power from the futures they endorse, thereby condemning the disempowered to live in the past. This is someone who's particularly interested in Afrofuturism, a particular tradition of trying to think about thinking the future in non-Western ways. I want to connect it here to interests to do with the economic sphere and corporate actors that I'm going to come to now. But I guess the general theme, the way we might gloss that quotation, would be exactly to say that those who fail to develop visions for the future themselves are condemned to live in a kind of future shaped by the visions of others. That these are somehow consequential political matters. And I think this, as I say, although in his words has a certain significance to do with post-colonialism, and clearly that's not something that is any less important today than when he was writing in the early 2000s. I think a way that we can read his words slightly differently today is by looking at these great sources of corporate monopoly power in Silicon Valley, which again I think we might read in similar ways as efforts to develop narratives about the future which, to the extent that politicians have not enough to say about the future, become ones by which societies live. I was recently reading this book that I'm sure some of you have come across by the Palantir chief executive, Alexander Karp. It's called The Technological Republic. And it's got a very interesting preface. The whole book is, I guess, is interesting. And the preface sort of sets it up as basically an effort to show why Silicon Valley should engage with thinking about the future and with what he calls a kind of national project. Sometimes similar writers also talk about a civilizational project. Many of these people are not just interested in a particular nation, but a wider civilization, as they call it. And for Karp, what's particularly important is that Silicon Valley has often, just as we criticize politicians for becoming obsessed with the sort of the small issues that might determine the next election rather than the big issues of a longer term project. What Karp is saying about his fellow Silicon Valley entrepreneurs that too many of you have got obsessed about the small trivial details about how to turn a quick profit, how to, for example, with social media, to cater to consumerist impulses, maybe to make quite a lot of money. But for Karp, this is not really where it's at, that we actually, in Silicon Valley, we need to rather lift our eyes to a kind of higher purpose. And it seems to me that this one book by one CEO of Palantir is, I think, redolent of a much more general theme in contemporary ideological production of Silicon Valley, which is exactly the sense that there's a sort of, in their own understanding, a kind of moral project in play, a project for the future, a project about society, about a vision for improving societies. We might not want to endorse their visions of improving societies, but I think this willingness to state their projects in these terms is kind of striking. And it's that contrast that I had on the first slide between Musk about this idea of excitement for the future, that we need to get enthusiastic about it, we need something that's worth living for, because otherwise, why do you get out of bed in the morning? This sort of sense of a higher purpose, I think, is something that saturates a lot of the thinkers of contemporary Silicon Valley, just as its sort of absence seems to be so characteristic of a lot of contemporary representative politics. I put down Peter Thiel here. Some of you maybe have read his book from, I think it's 12 years ago, 0 to 1. It's a written out text of a series of lectures that he was giving, and it's basically talking to entrepreneurs, budding entrepreneurs, but again in a way that's a bit like his Palantir colleague Karp, in such a way as to sort of emphasize a sort of moral calling that you should care about the long-term future. Don't care about the next quarter. Don't be the kind of corporate actor that just wants to worry about quarterly profits. We're bigger than that. Maybe that's the Silicon Valley of the past, or maybe that's the industrial corporations of the past. They worried simply about these kind of productivity goals or profit goals. But if you really want to be a corporate actor on the next level up, that's not what it's about. It's about achieving a monopoly. It's about using that as the basis on which to pursue goals which go far further into the future. Thiel talks about decades into the future, that this is what you want your startup ultimately to allow you to do, to be a platform on which to think about the further future, not just to think about how to win out in competition within the next quarter, the next year, and so on. He talks about the startup as the largest group of people you can convince of a plan to build a different future. Again, that's kind of interesting to me as a sort of parallel to this idea of the party. just as we had earlier on Kautsky talking about the party as a kind of cause, as a collective cause, oriented to the future. You've got these people in contemporary Silicon Valley say, well, that's what the startup is. The startup is basically, it's a group of people that agree on a certain image of the future that they want to create. And if they're successful, if they can achieve anything like monopoly status, and for people like Thiel and Karp, it's all about getting to that. They don't believe in competition. They don't believe in, or at least competition is for the little guys. But once you get to the proper level of monopoly status, that's when you can really start to achieve something more transformational, and the startup exactly cast in these terms as a kind of vehicle of future making. The final point I put down here, from political manifestos to corporate manifestos, simply, again, another echo that strikes me. Some of you may have seen just a few weeks ago, I think it's about 2 weeks ago, that Karp's book was rendered as a kind of manifesto by Palantir, a corporate manifesto. It's quite political in its ambition. It's about saying, well, the US needs compulsory military conscription, the US needs higher military spending, it needs to think about how it's going to prepare itself for the wars of the future, which are AI wars and so on. Of course, this is all being said by a company that wants to have contracts for exactly equipping the US military to that effect, so it's not entirely disinterested by any means. But the whole spirit of this is consciously cast as a manifesto. It talks about the decades, it's got this kind of historical sweep about it. And again, it seems so grand in its ambition compared to those things that often look quite small when we encounter them in electoral politics, manifestos that look more like shopping lists of things that you can achieve before the next election, possibly even much sooner than that. I put down also Mark Andreessen here. Some of you will have come across the Techno-Optimist Manifesto of his of 2023. Again, something like a kind of corporate manifesto expressing great optimism about the place of AI in contemporary politics and contemporary societies more generally, and why we should glorify it, essentially, why we should not be afraid of AI, why we should embrace it. Again, a kind of a corporate manifesto written in the large emotional visionary terms of a seer, bit like what Musk is inciting at the very beginning, and in some ways also, to make another connection in the talk, I mean, he deliberately cites Marinetti, Italian futurist, saying he locates himself within the tradition of these type of visionaries that want to disrupt the world around them, that want to bring the house down in the name of something much more exciting to come. I think this is not just interesting as a set of parallels. In other words, interesting that in the same way that we might talk about a crisis of the political future, there seems to be a sense in which the future is alive and well as an object of corporate speculation. But I think it's also, of course, important for the political implications. When corporate actors talk in these ways, of course, you might suspect they're trying to ensure that the future is imagined to their benefit, that it reserves a kind of central place for them, whether that's to do with cultivating the expectation that AI is either desirable or at least unavoidable, that it's happening, all the kind of things that might be relevant to whether one tries to regulate it or not. Of course, likewise, things to do with the geopolitical context, the place of armaments, the place of preparations for what is coming, cultivating expectations of the conflicts to come, the global conflicts to come, and the need to prepare for them. If you are a supplier of weapons, clearly it matters to cultivate a certain expectation of the future as a place of conflict, or at least something to prepare for, even if one can hope to ward off that conflict by preparing for it. So this much to say, and I think, as I say, it kind of is a contemporary way of reading Kodwa Eshun's words, which were written about something slightly different, but I think they travel quite neatly to this problematique, which is to say that insofar as the future always matters in some way, because people's hopes, expectations, fears, this is the stuff out of which political decisions are made or not made. Investments in this case, certain industries are done with consent or without it. Insofar as these things are crucial, then if politicians retreat from trying to occupy that territory of the future and trying to do something with it, then others are all too willing to speak to those same themes. So I wanted to come now to the last part of my talk, probably about 7 minutes or so, possibly even 5 minutes. This, I think, everything I've said so far perhaps builds to this sense that there's a risk that one ends up living in futures that are made not by actors that have any kind of claim to testing their visions of the future through democratic politics. Of course, that at least you could say was the claim of party politics, much to be said in criticism of party politics. But I guess the argument you might have made for it was it's a way of pitting different ideas of the future as they embodied in organizations such as parties against each other, ensuring that none of them is wholly hegemonic, ensuring that there's some type of contestation of certain ideas of the future against others. And so clearly to the extent that that is a problem today, then that's something that is, I think, of some democratic significance. What might it mean to democratize the future? In other words, to bring back this kind of question of the place of the future as an object of speculation, of agency, and so on into contemporary politics? Well, I guess partly that's a question of why did it recede? What is that? What lies behind the loss of the future in politics? In this book, in much more detail than I'm going to try to say now, I try to make the argument that it's got something to do with various forms of disempowerment in politics. That at one level, it is, of course, a very turbulent world, invites people to think about the present, to become immersed in the latest emergency. And I think a lot of politicians, and indeed societies more generally, often feel themselves battered from one emergency to the next. And the temporality of crisis is perhaps the temporality of the present. But of course, you might say, fine, but I mean, these corporate actors we've just been talking about, they live in that same world. They're also, in some cases, quite interested in disruption, in making it more turbulent. Why do they not seem to be, in the same way, overcome by that sense of the irrelevance or the unmanageability of the future? And as I say, in the book, I try to make a claim more to the effect that it's got something to do with disempowerment, that things become emergencies when you feel unable to control them. Of course, we live in a world of turbulence where there are things, objective emergencies of various kinds, to do with climate, to do with economy, inequality, and so on. But perhaps these things especially become emergencies when you feel that they resist any type of agency. They resist the capacity to control them. And this, I think, is something that is prevalent both in electoral politics, in representative politics, and in societies more widely amongst the populations that are governed by those systems, this sense of incapacity to control the future. I guess at the micro level, you might say, well, this is something to do with the contemporary economy. I say micro level. At the level of everyday experience, of course, the contemporary economy is the structure as well. But those living in precarious jobs, those living on short-term contracts, you might say, well, what is the place of the future in an economy structured in those ways? Because everything is very volatile. The capacity to plan is all that much less if you are in a kind of position of economic precarity. So the powerlessness that comes at that kind of everyday level, I think, is part of this retreat from a wider kind of orientation to the future. But I think it's also something that you can tell a similar story at the level of, not of everyday experience, but of political institutions that have been weakened systematically vis-a-vis corporate actors of the kind we've just been described. Also a story you can tell about political organizations, such as parties themselves, which often have people that are very future-oriented within them, but disempower those people, are precisely structured so that their most short-termist people are the people that lead them, and that the people that join parties because they believe in some kind of long-term cause are often those who are kept quite far removed from the structures of power within a political party. So it seems to me that this wider theme that we've been playing with to do with the retreat from a certain type of orientation to the future in contemporary politics. At one level, it's maybe something that's to do with cultural factors of imagination, but I think it's perhaps more crucially to do with questions to do with the organizations that can give credibility to trying to shape the future and the loss of those types of institution. And in the book, just to briefly reference the things I go into more detail there, some of the argument is very much about how does one try to re-empower those types of institutions which have been weakened in precisely this way, whether that's local government, whether it's parties, whether it is the state itself after years of austerity that make it increasingly unable to do anything but react to problems that are created elsewhere, much less able to intervene on them in advance. There's another aspect to this that we might talk about perhaps further in the Q&A to do with transnational politics, the European Union, for example, because clearly some of these questions to do with organizations, it's also questions to do with are there institutions that are receptive to these organizations? The European Union has got many different institutions in it, and I think that is itself a challenge for planning, a challenge for orienting yourself to the future in a way that is anything other than reactive. Insofar as contemporary politics in the European context has this kind of problem of many hands, think of the EU institutions, Commission, Council, different versions of the Council, Parliament, and so on. This, I think itself, this kind of extreme divisions of powers that come with that, I think serve the same, or accentuate the same problem of the felt disempowerment that comes for those within such a system. So, to draw things together, the argument I've tried to make is firstly that historically, politics has had a great deal to do with the future, and that those defining themselves in terms of political ideologies and parties meant to instantiate those have often treated the future as very much their point of reference. And I think we live in an age where that's perhaps much less the case. I don't think an argument of pure presentism really holds. This is a world of anxieties, of fears, of concerns about what lies ahead. But it's exactly in that respect rather different from an orientation to the future which is based on a vision of how we might agentially intervene on the future. Think of that Przeworski quotation I had about transformative visions about a common future, this as being a casualty of the 20th century. As I've tried to argue, that is something that marks a loss within the realm of democratic politics, because certain things are achieved by that place of the future in politics to do with the possibility of critically assessing the present, identifying injustices, identifying problems. This itself requires a certain kind of lifting yourself out of the present to see the present from the perspective of the imagined future. I think questions to do with collectivity in politics, questions to do with perseverance in politics are also themes I try to link to that. And perhaps most crucially, as I've tried to argue today, also insofar as politics becomes less oriented to the future, those who remain very oriented to the future have got basically a free hand, can use that to shape the expectations in a way that serves certain types of corporate interest. And it's not just perhaps corporate interest, a wider kind of vision that goes beyond mere interest. And so all of that then to say that there's a democratic issue there, there's a democratic problem. I think it's something in terms of how one might address it. It's all to do with not just a kind of act of imagining the future, just being creative again. I think this is sadly how often when people talk about the need to think more about the future, it almost is rendered as a kind of psychological act of imagination. We need to lift our eyes to think about the world to come. For me, while that is clearly part of the story, it's also about those kinds of political structures, institutions, organizations that can give credibility to the future, that can instantiate some kind of political cause that goes from the present into the future. It's the crisis of those institutions, I think, which is at the heart of the crisis of the future today. I'm going to stop at this point, and I'll be very pleased to take any questions on these themes or any other things that you want to put on the agenda to do with democracy in the future. Thank you.